So today, what we want to talk about is what data flow mapping looks like and how to start. Well, first of all, we should cover off who we are. Risk Crew are a group of information security governance, risk compliance and testing professionals. We provide 100% satisfaction guaranteed service, and that's quite unusual in our industry, but it's something we're very proud to do. Just a couple of words about myself. I've been involved with information security governance, risk and compliance professional for over 15 years, and that's assisting clients with the implementation of data protection and information security management system requirements. I'm an acting DPO for several clients, and I'm a lead ISO 27001 implementer. We've had success this year, and we had half a dozen successes last year with clients getting 27001 certification. So the topics we're going to be covering today are Article 30 requirements. And of course, by Article 30, I mean GDPR, which you're probably all aware of. That's Article 30 of the GDPR, and it lays down some specific requirements. We're going to be covering where to start with the mapping, how to map, the benefits and advantages, and then we'll have some time at the end for some questions and answers. Let's have a quick look at the Article 30 requirements, just to see where we are. I should mention, by the way, that if you do have any questions, please type them in the text message box. That's part of the platform that we're using for this webinar. And now Article 30, that's actually titled the Records of Processing Activities. There are several paragraphs in this article, but the first one being, each controller shall maintain a record of processing activities under its responsibility. So that's a clear requirement for the controllers, but the processors of data don't get off so easily either. Paragraph 2 states, each processor shall maintain a record of all categories of processing activities carried out on behalf of a controller. Now, to build a record of processing activities, you need to know what data you have, where it is, and what you are doing with it. In other words, you need to carry out an inventory of the information you have, and that's where data flow mapping can really help. Now, the Data Protection Act also introduces some additional safeguards over and above what GDPR requirement has, and has a very specific requirement on the type of documentation you need if you're processing any special categories of personal data. But we'll probably touch on that at the end, because most cases that won't be a requirement. So how do we start? The first thing really is an inventory. We've got to take an inventory of the information that we have, and we've got to make sure that we understand what personal data you possess and if any of it belongs to people within the European Union. Now, that's a very good point to make, because technically we're no longer in the European Union, but the European Union GDPR legislation is part of UK legislation, and it also applies if we're marketing services or any type of product to people within the European Union. At any point of that where it occurs, it means we must have the documentation to be compliant. Specifically, Article 30 requires us to document the name and address of our data protection officer, the controller of the information, and any joint controllers, and any data processors that we use. We also need to document the intent of the organization's data processing activity, the details and types of any personal data we collect. We need to document the transfer of personal data to and from the EU and any other country or organisation we may wish to share it with. They have to have details of contracts or agreements as applicable to any data sharing that goes on. And we have to have information on the technical controls of ourselves and of other organisations that's there to protect that particular data. What we need to understand, and this is where data mapping can help, is how is personally identifiable information being managed by the organisation throughout its entire life cycle? Who is responsible for that data across the organisation and through its life cycle? Where are the touch points and the system interfaces associated with the information, and specifically with any processes or sub-processes that we use? Where is the data stored, such as backup tapes, servers, desktops, SharePoint files, spreadsheets, anywhere, but where is the data stored and what applications make use of it? We also want to know who has privilege to access that data. Just as an aside, and there's a question here, and please type your responses in the text box on the platform. If you process personally identifiable information in conjunction with another organisation, who is the data controller? It seems quite a simple question, but both organisations would be joint controllers. Yep. Now, it's interesting to note there is actually no limit to the number of joint controllers you can have, but things do get unwieldy if you have more than two, as a lot of the processing, a lot of the procedures and things are replicated and become very cumbersome to implement. Now let's get back to the main topic and where to start. It's always best to start with an information audit. The reason why we want to do an audit is we need to answer the questions: what information do I have? Where do I have it? And then we need to identify what types of data we process and how and where it is processed, stored and transmitted. This is the data process flow, how it originates within the organisation, acquired, how it flows through that organisation, it's processed, how it's shared, how it's stored, and ultimately how long it's kept for before it's deleted. In the information audit, what we want to do is identify the data owners, the controllers, the stakeholders, the data protection officer, any joint controllers we may have, any processes, any sub-processes. We want to identify the processing's lawful purpose. Why are we doing it, and what is the lawful purpose for why we're doing it? We want to look at the data classification to identify if there's any sensitive information. Sensitive information requires additional safeguards, so we need to be aware of it. When we're talking about disclosure days, who do we share the information with? Why are we sharing the information? Is that disclosure really required? We need to be aware of this. Are we transferring the data within the EU, outside of the EU? Why are we transferring it? What's the purpose of the transfer, and what safeguards are there on the transfer process? We need to look at the data management of the data, how it's stored, who has access to it, the retention periods, how it's erased. And we need to know what controls are in place to ensure that we've got proper governance of the data. We will maintain that governance through its life cycle. This is a an information audit template that we use. Quite often we use this as a basis, but modify it to reflect the organization we're working with and the specific types of data that they collect and process. It's very useful for sort of doing a first level check, a first level sort of assessment of what data you've actually got. These are all the main points we want there. We may include any other data that we can get out of there, because quite often we find is during these audits, we uncover data that the organization didn't know it had, and we discover processing that the organization wasn't aware of. So the more information we can gather, the better. So now we're coming on how to map. And it's an interesting thing to do. It's quite a hard exercise to do, but it needs to be done. But let's look at first the objectives for documenting the data process flow and what we need to do here. We need to identify the scope and life cycle of the personally identifiable information, how it's collected, processed, stored, and transmitted, the accountability for the data as it flows through the organization, and we need to identify the services, device, applications, and the data flows through. That's the main objectives that we're looking for here. And then we want to visually depict this, this data flow for stakeholder validation and for ongoing reference. The essential elements of this exercise is to map the data flow by how it moves through the organization, how and where the information is disclosed. And we don't, I mean, disclosed to anybody within the organization. It could be various teams, could be departments, and then is it disclosed to people outside of the organization? We need to know how that information is accessed, by who, and how the information is processed, stored, and transmitted across the organization. Some information will be sensitive and will require encryption. Other information, not so much. So the process mapping should illustrate the entire data processing lifecycle and the people holding accountability for the data at any given point in time. It should indicate the type of data, who the controller and processors are, and the formats of the data. By that I mean, is it database, is it hard copy, soft copy, is it just any format which is there is covered by GDPR. So we need to be aware of what format it exists in. What data transfer techniques are being used, and where is it being stored or processed. Once we have that information, we can depict a visual representation of what it looks like. This is quite a good example. It's actually quite a simple scheme, but it's good for showing one particular technique that I like to use, and that's we've broken down, or we've analysed one specific business process. For this one, it's the order fulfillment. So we have on the left-hand side how the orders are received and the information that's come in there, how it moves through the organization's systems, who it's shared with, what it's done. We have at the bottom there, the legend depicts what's happening at various stages, how the data is combined, how it's used, what it consists of. And it also depicts what data is sensitive, what is non-sensitive, whether it has personally identifiable information. While it's a simple, simplified data process flow, just for an example, you can see that it actually touches on another business process. This is the loyalty program vendors. So there's a loyalty program. Various vendors are signed up for it, so we're sharing that information. It's rather likely we'll have personally identifiable information in there. So we need to know, how is it being shared? What contracts do we have in place? How are we joint controllers of that, or are they merely processors of that? This is all the information we need to collect, and this is how we can depict it. But it's a good example because it shows how it touches on other business processes, even though it's just looking at one at the moment, but then it quickly expands. This is a fairly simplified data mapping diagram that we've managed to build from the information that we've collected during a particular audit. It graphically depicts where the data resides and who has access to that data. It needs filling out a bit more. We've just taken a simplified version of it because we need to know whether the data is secured, is it encrypted, has it been anonymized, for example. And the legend on the right-hand side depicts various elements we can use on this, but it does build up a nice simplified picture which just about anybody can understand of what the data is, where it is, and who we share it with. It's just one of the methods we use, and it depends very much on what the target audience is for the diagrams, for the data flow mapping exercise, as to how you depict that information. This is another approach, and it very much looks like flow charting, but it's a good way of identifying specific steps in there. It's also a good way of identifying where you've got missing information. I mean, for this example, we have an activity here. The third one is sent to zero. But what are we sending to zero? Does it include any personally identifiable information? Why are we sending it to zero, and in what format? So it's helping me to identify that we've got an operation in place there, but it needs breaking down into further steps, and we need to identify what safeguards, what controls are in place for that particular operation. And that happens at various places. So at each one, you'll think, do I need to break it down? Of course, if the information that's being processed and being transferred and disclosed contains no personally identifiable information, then no, you don't need to go into so much detail, and we can move on. Our focus is always on the personally identifiable information. So just coming back to our objectives, what we wanted to do was answer the fundamental questions that need to be addressed by the organisation. What data specifically is collected? How sensitive is the data? Is it just personally identifiable, or is it special category personally identifiable? Why is that information being collected? How is it collected? Where do we get the data from? When do we collect it? Who has access to that data? Is it sent to a processor or a sub-processor? If it is, do we have processing agreements in place? Where are they located? Are there international transfers involved? How long is that data going to be retained, and how is it to be destroyed? And that's a question both for our organisation and any organisations that we share it with. And here we have another aside, and again, if you'd like to type your answers into the text box on there. But do you know, in 2019, what percentage of UK organisations saw a rise in subject access requests? Was it less than 50% or more than 50%? I'll just give a couple of minutes there, see whether or not anybody answers. Well, here we go. It was actually 63% of UK organisations suddenly saw a rise in subject access requests. Now, while that would seem like an aside, it's actually quite related to the data mapping exercise that we're doing. Because if you don't know what data you've got, how it's structured, where it's stored things, how can you respond to a subject access request? If you can't respond appropriately, that could lead to complaints to the ICO, and that can have other consequences. So one of the benefits and the advantage of doing a data flow mapping exercise is understanding what personally identifiable information you have. What information you've got, why you've got it, and how it's being processed puts you in a far better position to be able to deal with subject access requests. So data mapping supports compliance and adherence to some of the critical GDPR factors, such as maintenance of the data lifecycle. It ensures records are kept to the rules of the GDPR, and we can submit them to the regulatory and supervising authorities if called upon to do so. It maintains accountability for the data during its full life cycle within the organisation, and it helps provide evidence for the organisation that the data is protected. Additionally, it shows improvement in various areas of the IT systems and businesses processes by regulating data flows. It reduces the risk of a data breach by data protection. And again, that comes down to by understanding what information you have, understanding its sensitivity, you can apply appropriate safeguards to protect that information, which reduces the risk of a data breach. But it makes sure that the protection measures are put in place are appropriate to that data. It provides records to track the compliance and breach event discoveries with minimized costs. So it really does help to understand the data that you have, because if you do have a data breach, you understand what the nature of that breach is and what the potential impacts of that breach are going to be. The data mapping also helps in the data lifecycle management and the maintenance of procedures and policies or rules for GDPR compliance. So that's my presentation. It's moved along a bit quicker than I expected, but what we're going to do now is move on to the question and answer section. Sorry. Well, let's turn my camera back on now, just so we've got that, and hopefully we'll open it up to some questions and answers, and we'll see how we go. Well, at the moment, I'm not seeing many questions, but hopefully they'll come back in. What we're going to do at the end of the presentation is there's a takeaway you can take with the PDF of the presentation. There are email addresses on there, so we can be contacted. If you do have any questions or want some follow-up, then please do contact us. And we're very happy to talk about this and give you a free consultation. Oh, sorry, I do have a question here. The question is, I'm supposed to keep my data up to date where necessary. What does this mean? That's a very good question. GDPR does require that you keep the data up to date and accurate. Consider if you're dealing with particular clients or order fulfillment, it's very important that you keep the client's address details up to date. It's no point delivering to their old address. So you have to keep the information up to date, but there are some elements where it's necessary to do so, and delivery addresses is one of them. Other ones, probably not so much. People's names, if people's change the names, then that would be need to be kept up to date. You probably get a subject access request on that to update somebody's details if they've got married or they've changed the name. But the where necessary is on data which is changed, which could have an impact on that particular data subject. Another question is, if I will be processing personal data obtained from a third party, what obligations do I have to check that it has been obtained in an appropriate manner? That all comes down to the lawful basis for processing that information. If that processing relies on consent, you need to comply or to understand how that consent was gained, and is it still relevant. So it depends on what the processing purpose is and the lawful basis for doing that process. We would have to understand each situation as it came, because each one is different. But anything that relies on consent, the consent would have to be given, and it would have to be demonstrable to us as processors of the data that consent has been given and has been freely given as complying with the requirements of GDPR. Now, those are the only questions I've received at the moment, but if you've got any more, then please do. If you can type them into the box provided, I'll be more than happy to answer them as they arrive. Give it a few more minutes. I don't seem to be getting any more questions, so we'll skip to the last slide. Please feel free to contact us after the presentation. If you've got any questions, need any more information, then our contact details are there. Please give us a call or drop us an email. My name is Andy Whitaker, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for your attending.